The television world was stunned when Jon Stewart suddenly announced that later this year he'll be stepping down from his Comedy Central franchise.
17 years is the longest I have ever in my life held a job by 16 years and 5 months. Thank you. The upshot there being, I am a terrible employee. But in my heart, I know it is time for someone else to have that opportunity.
The openly liberal comedian rarely criticizes President Obama, but when he does, such as after the Paris rally for press freedom following those terror attacks, it stings.
How could Obama not be there? Look how many world leaders he could have bowed down to and apologized.
And when John McCain told me that Stewart is unfair to Republicans, I got the treatment.
From immigration to rogue nations to conflagrations, this past Sunday our nation's leading journalistic lights sought answers to the day's most pressing questions.
You've been on The Daily Show. Is Jon Stewart fair to Republicans? All this in contrast to Stewart's friend and frequent guest Brian Williams, out on suspension as the head of NBC Universal called his conduct inexcusable, and the sadness of Bob Simon's death. Joining us now to examine all of this, Rich Lowry, editor of National Review and a Fox News contributor, Marisa Guthrie, who covers television for The Hollywood Reporter, and Joe Klein, columnist for Time magazine. Marisa, Jon Stewart's a comedian who became a cutting-edge social, political, and media critic. How in the name of Mesopotamia did he do that?
Well, I think he came along at exactly the right time. The myth of the voice of God anchor had already been exploded. And so he could, and cable news had ramped up and was, 24-hour talking head fest. So, there were always going to be times when these people put their foots in their mouths. And so he had these huge targets in which to expose hypocrisy, which really endeared him to his young audience, who was already suspicious of media.
Right, a lot of huge targets. Rich, Stewart is upfront about leaning left, shall we say, and mostly skewers Republicans and Fox News and Bill O'Reilly, but it's all cloaked in comedy.
This is one of my big problems with him. He is constantly lecturing us about the tone of our politics. But he was a big-time political commentator himself, and what he added to the conversation...
No. He says, I'm just a comedian.
Yeah, well, this is the game he would play. He would want to be taken seriously at some level, and then if you caught him in something, being wrong about something or being dishonest about something, I'm a comedian. But what he added to our political discourse was largely sarcasm, insults, and dishonest editing. And look, mockery's always been part of politics since time immemorial, so that's his right. But please don't lecture us about how the tone of our politics needs to be elevated when that's what you do.
I think he added more to sarcasm. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that the way you judge comedy is not by whether it's honest or dishonest. It's whether it's funny or not. And the guy was a genius. The guy is a genius. He was just absolutely brilliant. And he is very, very smart. I was part of a panel with him up in New Hampshire that was not on television, that involved the president of MSNBC. This was about 10 years ago, and Bill Kristol and several others. And Stewart took us all apart. He was dead serious. This is a very smart guy. This is a real loss, just in terms of fun.
Yeah, I mean, I've interviewed him enough times to agree that he's not only smart, but he is very cutting. I don't just mean cutting in the sarcastic sense, but in his analysis of what's wrong with the media, what's wrong with politicians. Let me play the classic 10-second Jon Stewart clip, this one occurring a decade ago at CNN.
Here's just what I wanted to tell you guys.
Yeah.
Stop. Stop hurting America.
Okay. So he basically single-handedly got Crossfire canceled. And I would argue, whether you agree with Rich or not, that he had a real impact on the business because news anchors and shows began copying the Daily Show technique of using videotape, less selectively than a comedian would, to call out hypocrisy and inconsistencies.
Well, I think he had a real impact on the political class, too, because he could use the same videotape to expose them. And they all still came on his show because, his view was they were just politicians are just inherently narcissistic, so they come on. But I think that the media watched him, and there was some pride. There was like a weird pride they took in being skewered by Jon Stewart.
Yeah, Megyn Kelly said... Hallie seems kind of prideful at the beginning of the segment about it.
Did I look that way? No, the dirty little secret is you hope that he goes after you. The same thing with Stephen Colbert, and then you were just so outraged and upset, and you get this feud going. Although Megyn Kelly said to me the other night that she thought he was kind of mean at times in the service of comedy.
Well, comedians usually are mean. Look, I don't disagree with points being made here about how influential he was and how smart he was, but if you're a conservative and you went on one of the reporter interview segments, they would talk to you for an hour and then chop it up to make you look like a crude idiot. Just a little thing. There are these Washington Redskins fans who agreed to go on to talk about defending the name, and they asked, are we going to be confronted by Native Americans? I said, no. You're not. Don't worry about it. Sure enough, they're ambushed by Native Americans. That's Jerry Springer-like ethics. And this gets to, again, to the two sides of him. On one side, he's the guy who lectures us about the tone of our politics. On the other side, when you catch him this sort of stuff, he says, oh, I'm just a comedian, don't pay attention.
That was a very big mistake, but to the Daily Show's credit, it did apologize and didn't use some of the footage because the people felt that they'd been sandbagged. And yet we have this situation, Joe Klein, where every poll shows, and particularly young people, obviously, that Stewart is a trusted figure. They think he kind of cuts through the BS in a way that many people who practice what we think of as real journalism are not.
Well, that's a problem we have, especially for younger people who have all of these different sources of information, and if it isn't enjoyable, they're not going to watch it. You had the president saying if it bleeds, it leads. For younger people, if it's not entertaining, forget about it.
And so all this happening in a week when, as I mentioned at the top, you have a major anchor getting suspended, you have the passing of Bob Simon, you have the death also of New York Times columnist David Carr, which I'll talk about in a couple moments. How does all this sort out?
Well, I think that this is a time when, as Joe said, what was also so powerful about Jon's show is that these little bits could go viral, and it was tailored to how young people consume content. They're not watching the 6:30 broadcasts. And so I think that,
Wait a second. I mean, one of about 20 million people watch the three network newscasts. Right. We all say they're dinosaurs, they're going away, and it's an older audience, but that's why what happened at NBC was a big story.
Right, but I think young people, I think the demographic for the evening news is aging out. And, eventually there will be...
The polite way of saying dying.
Dying.
All you have to do is look at the ads on those three broadcasts.
Eventually there'll be a reckoning.
They're all for senility drugs.
And everything will be sort of streamed and SVOD.
I cannot remember the last time I sat down and turned on the TV and watched The Daily Show. But I always knew what he was saying because I would pick it up on liberal blogs. On Bob Simon, I just want to make a point here about the importance, when everything's so much shorter and so much faster, and there's a premium on that across all media, on long-form journalism. He did these pieces that have stuck with me for years about the monks on Mount Athos, about this orchestra in Congo playing Beethoven's Ninth that were moving, they were soulful, and they almost restored your trust in what journalism can do, your faith in what journalism can do.
But you can't have a career, it's very unlikely to have a career like Bob had, and have that training and that seasoning, because he came up through when the broadcast networks had tons of money, and he could go somewhere and spend weeks there reporting a story. You can't do that anymore.
Hasn't the internet become almost like Jon Stewart on steroids in the sense that...
But not nearly as funny.
Not nearly as funny and not necessarily accurate either. And where when somebody gets into trouble, there is this hue and cry, and the person is absolutely demonized. And you know what it's like to be on the end of a feeding frenzy. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, well, I think that we're living in an era where the ferocity of the prosecution is much greater than the severity of most of these crimes. And that's true not only for people like Brian Williams, but also for most of the politicians we cover. I mean,
why is it not?
I really want to have a president who has messed around. I really want to have. I mean, my idea of a great president.
We had one of those, Joe.
No, we had. Yeah, we had. One of those. No, and we had. There was another one who lied to the American people continually on matters of war and peace, who messed around, who drank a pitcher of martinis every night, and my grandfather voted for him 4 times.
Okay, but let's come back to the treatment of media people and why you think it's unfair.
But it's all public people. It's not just media people, because
media people depend on credibility. And if they're constantly getting clawed at and pushed at.
And all of us make mistakes. All of us do make mistakes.
You've been talking about a bloodlust in.
I see that bloodlust. And, Rich was saying before, Bob Simon almost made you trust journalism again. I trust journalism by and large. When I'm out there in the Middle East, having RPG shot, no, I know that. But I see people like Dexter Filkins and other war reporters who really do the Lord's work.
That's true. That's well said. But the thing that was so amazing about the Brian Williams incident is if there's any time you can't be inconsistent or make anything up, and you're going to get caught, it's this era with so much attention on the media and social media and all the rest of it.
But that's why I do believe that the word conflation was appropriate. When the story first happened, he reported it accurately. And I know that over time, the stories that you tell kind of tend to
But you can't tell them when there's a camera on you, and it will live forever online as the smoking gun of your guilt.
Right.
And
it was a very bad mistake. He blew the apology, and there were going to be consequences.
Let me take just a moment to talk about David Carr. He was the media columnist of the New York Times. He collapsed in the Times newsroom and died this week. And, he was a quirky, funny, sometimes prickly character with a very original voice, very big on Twitter. He and I tangled at times, especially when he wrote a memoir about having been a crack addict as a young man. And then he wrote the most generous columns ever been published about me. And so he really, a lot of journalists have just been outpouring. The outpouring of tributes has been amazing. Let me put up on the screen one thing that Carr wrote just last week, give you a sense of his voice. We want our anchors to be everywhere, to be impossibly famous, globe-trotting, hilarious, down to earth, and above all, trustworthy. It's a job description that no one can match. That is very true. David Carr was 58.